The miracle doctor won't be a kept man. My heart belongs ashore. Chapter 541. Let me go, Shuri screamed as she struggled. If you come down, we'll let you go. Smirking lustfully, the security guard continued to pull her out. His movements alerted the security control room, and several more guards rushed out. When they saw Shuri, they rushed over without a word and grabbed her arms to haul her out of the car. Shuri's clothes were already a mess thanks to Ted's bodyguard, and now her disheveled hair only made her look more like a madwoman. If not for her curvaceous figure and dazzling sports car, no one would believe that she was a beautiful woman. Bitch, how dare you show your face here again? You want to die? A fat security guard strode over and gave Shuri 2 slaps. Ah, she howled in pain. Shuri Caden, if you don't want to die now, hand over the company seal. I'll give you a chance. As long as you sign the authorization letter, you won't have to suffer. If I take you back, who knows what Mr. Sherman and Mr. Ted will do to you. Although Shuri had been beaten, she remained firm and said through gritted teeth, "In your dreams." Still trying to fight back? Smack! The fat guard raised his hand and slapped her again. Shuri reeled and almost keeled over from the impact. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth as she looked around frantically for Kiran to help. Bam! The fat man punched her in the lower abdomen. It knocked the wind out of her, and she doubled up and crouched on the ground, unable to make a sound. A few other security guards seized her arms, not at all bothering to be gentle. "Take her away," the fat guard ordered smugly. At that moment, Kiran was already in front of them, eyeing them coldly. When the fat guard saw him, he scowled at him threateningly. "Keep staring, and I'll gouge your eyes out." He then prepared to take Shuri inside triumphantly. "Stop right there," Kiran boomed. "Who gave you the right to commit violence?" Pah! The fat guard spat on the ground and sneered. "You should have just kept your mouth shut when you had the chance. If you let her go and apologize on your knees, I'll spare your lives." Kiran glanced at Shuri apologetically. He had intended to test if what she had said was true. There were a lot of problems surrounding Mysticor Enterprise, but he did not have much time to deal with them. Once Aurora's parents were awakened, the involvement of family ties would further complicate things. So he decided it was better not to revive them before he settled the company's issues to avoid future trouble. He had not completely believed Shuri at first. However, now that he had witnessed her being beaten and threatened upon her arrival, he was finally convinced that Mysticor Enterprise was under Walter's control and that Shuri was worthy of his trust. Therefore, he could now help her without worry. "If we let her go and apologize on our knees, you'll spare our lives?" "Are you fucking stupid, punk?" Grinning sinisterly, the fat security guard repeated Kiran's words and pointed at himself. "Do you know why we're not afraid to hit her even though she's the general manager of Mysticor Enterprise? The company belongs to the Sherman family now, not the Sinfield family, and Shuri Caden is even more of an outsider. Let me warn you, Mysticor's far more dangerous than it seems, and if you keep sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, you'll be dead before you know it." Then he marched up to Shuri's sports car and kicked it. Beep, beep. The alarm immediately went off. It sounded as if the car was wailing. "You will let her go and break your own legs," said Kiran lightly. Bang, bang, bang. Before the fat guard could fly into a rage, the other guards rushed forward and started punching and kicking the sports car. Kiran watched them, his lip curled. Before he could take action, a cacophony of honking cars sounded behind him. The car soon came to a halt, and more than 20 men in black got out, as well as several young men and women. The man in the center was splendidly dressed. However, his arm was wrapped in bandages, and his face was twisted with pain. It was none other than Ted. Kiran looked at him mockingly. Ted did not bother to spare Kiran a glance, his full attention trained on Shuri. Even at the sight of her miserable state, he did not display an ounce of sympathy. On the contrary, there was cruel amusement in his eyes. He whirled around to the fat security guard. "You had one fucking job, Sam. Why are you taking so much time to catch her when she's already shown up at the door?" Furious, he stormed forward and kicked the fat man. "You incompetent piece of shit." A while ago, Sam had called to inform him that Shuri had shown up at the office. Ted immediately ordered him to seize her, take her into a room, and strip her. He had expected her to be naked when he arrived, so he could get right down to business and take out his anger on her. He was exasperated to find that she was still at the entrance. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ted. We were too slow." Sam apologized hastily and jabbed a finger at Kiran. "It's all this guy's fault. He wants us to let Shuri go and apologize on our knees." "Well, ain't that bold?" Ted narrowed his eyes at Kiran. While they were talking, Kiran put on a mask to disguise himself, ready to mess with Ted. Although Ted found the man before him somewhat familiar, the latter did not wear Kiran's face, so he instantly dismissed the doubt and sneered. "Punk, How dare you meddle in my business and tell my men to apologize on their knees? Who do you think you are? He stepped forward, raised his other good hand, and pointed at Kiran's heart. In Fox, anyone who tries to give me orders dies. You want to be a knight in shining armor so bad, huh? Why don't you look in the mirror first? Do you know how many rats like you I've crushed under my foot? If it's death you're looking for, just say it, and I'll grant your wish. Ted glared at Kiran contemptuously, certain that he was just a hothead trying to play the white knight. Kiran gave no response. When Shuri noticed Kiran's mask, she understood right away that he had a plan of his own and thus did not expose his identity. At Kiran's silence, those who followed Ted eyed him disdainfully, thinking he was an idiot trying to save the damsel in distress. Mysticor Enterprise was the largest company in Fox. Now that Sawyer Sinfield was unconscious, it was inevitable that the Sherman family would inherit his business, and that made Ted a person whom Kiran could not afford to offend. Since Shuri had engaged someone to injure Ted, he was determined to turn her into his plaything to vent his fury. Ted's female companions crossed their arms and lifted their chins, the corners of their mouths upturned with scorn for Kiran. You will let Shuri go and then tell your guards to apologize on their knees and break their legs. Kiran regarded Ted and declared icily, that goes for your good hand too, or all of you will be very, very sorry. Chapter 542. Pfeft. Ted's female companions were the first to burst out laughing with their hands over their mouths, contempt written all over their faces. They found Kiran's demand utterly ridiculous. Did he not know where he was and who they were? How dare he challenge Ted so recklessly? When Ted heard that Kiran wanted him to impair his other good hand, his temper flared, and he stared at Kiran as if he were a fool. Are you threatening me? Do you know who I am, punk? He swaggered up to Kiran and jabbed a taunting finger at the latter's heart. Come on then. Make me sorry. Ha ha. His companions cackled. The women even raised their eyebrows seductively at Kiran, teasing and taunting him to their heart's content. Kiran chuckled. Just when Ted was about to speak, he vanished from his side with a whoosh. Thinking Kiran had fled, Ted snorted derisively. That's more like it. Bang! 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 Before he could finish, a series of crashes sounded, and he saw the security guards flying through the air. Meanwhile, Shuri was already in Kiran's arms. Kiran tapped her lightly on the back, and her breath returned, along with the color to her face. You've done it now, bastard. Chagrined that his men had been subdued, Sam grabbed his stun baton. I'm gonna fry you. Before he could move, Kiran zoomed through the air while still carrying Shuri. Before anyone could react, he appeared in front of Sam like a phantom. He was unsettlingly as fast as lightning. Sam had hardly managed to activate his stun baton when Kiran snatched it from his grip. Fry me? Grasping Sam's collar, he hauled the 200-pound man into the air with one hand effortlessly. Ah! Sam struggled in the air, trying to break free. Kiran lifted his foot and kicked Sam's lower body. Snap! Snap! Sickening cracks rang out as both of Sam's legs were broken. Ugh! An anguished scream erupted from him. His hands quivered, and he writhed twice before passing out from the pain. Bam! Kiran threw him on the ground like a dead dog. Gah! The impact snapped Sam back to consciousness, and he howled in agony. His legs had been completely damaged, rendering him crippled. There was silence at first, then fear and rage. Lying on the ground, Sam bellowed at his companions, "Destroy him! Smack! Smack!" Kiran stepped forward, lowered his head, and dealt him 2 tight slaps. Sam's incessant shrieking, along with his swollen cheeks, only made him look more pathetic. This is for smashing her car. Sneering, Kiran stomped on his right arm. The snap of bones sounded. Ted's female companions turned pale and retreated to his side in fright. Ted was also shocked by the sight. He had not expected Kiran to be so violent. For a second, it reminded him of a familiar feeling, the feeling of his fingers being broken. However, he could not comprehend why this idiot had the gall to play the hero when he was surrounded by so many opponents. Where did he get his audacity? Die! Ted's black-clothed guards dashed forward with daggers drawn. The atmosphere was rife with tension and the threat of imminent chaos. Wham! Without giving them a chance to attack, Kiran darted into their midst and sent several of them flying with a barrage of left kicks. Before the others could encircle him, he retreated and drove his foot into Sam's body, propelling him toward them. The guards backed away swiftly in alarm. Holding Shuri close, Kiran advanced toward Ted. Anticipating the danger, Ted tried to dodge, but Kiran seized him before he could budge. A chill ran down his spine. He instinctively hid his good hand behind his back, afraid that it would be wrecked. His female companions fled from his side in panic. Are you going to break your hand yourself, or do you want me to do it? Kiran asked with a half-smile. Ted stiffened as a familiar feeling of dread swept over him. It was the ghost of the pain he had experienced when his fingers were smashed earlier. His bodyguards hesitated to charge when they saw Ted being restrained by Kiran. "Back off or I'll destroy all his limbs," Kiran thundered. Everyone was horrified by his warning. Although there were dozens of them, armed with daggers too, no one dared step forward. The scene of Sam's limbs being broken was still vivid in their minds. They feared that if they stepped forward, they would be next. "Let Mr. Ted go. If you don't, we'll kill you." "Shuri Caden, tell him to let Mr. Ted go this instant." While they did not dare to move closer, they shouted as an act of bravado. Kiran ignored them and grabbed Ted's other hand. Although Ted was terrified, he maintained his haughty front and regarded Kiran coldly. "You're a savage one, I'll give you that. But if you let me go, I can pretend none of this happened. Otherwise, unless you kill me today, I'll make your whole family suffer." He cast a glare at Shuri. "My right hand was broken thanks to this ratbag you brought, bitch. I'm gonna make you pay by toying with you to my heart's content." Kiran chuckled, his lip twitching in amusement. Smack, smack. He released his grip and struck Ted twice on the cheek. "Prar-T." Ted spat out a mouthful of blood, and his cheeks swelled rapidly as if it were an inflated balloon. The color drained from his female companions' faces. The men in black were frantic, but they did not dare approach. Ted was livid. "Bastard, how dare you hit me? I'm gonna destroy you." Crack! The next second, Kiran snapped his good hand. "Ah!" Ted let out a harrowing yowl and bounded almost 2 feet high on the spot. The men in black and the security guards were stunned. His female companions clamped their hands over their mouths to rein their screams. There was anger, panic, and fear in their eyes as they looked at Kiran, all except ridicule. He was vicious, cruel, terrifying. "How are you going to destroy me, Ted?" he asked airily. Ted's features contorted with pain and fury. "You're dead meat, punk. My men will make you pay." As if on cue, the remaining bodyguards started phoning for backup. "Just you wait. Someone will come for your neck very soon," he declared arrogantly. Chapter 543. "Come for my neck?" Kiran snickered. "Who dare come for my neck when you're in my grip?" His gaze swept across the crowd. "If you're not scared that your precious Mr. Ted will die any moment, be my guest." If he were not trying to lure out the mastermind and completely eliminate the hidden dangers in Fawkes for the Sinfield family's sake, he would have already initiated a massacre. Who are these people compared to the Maui tribe, anyway? Are you trying to trade my life for yours? Sorry to burst your bubble, but regardless of whether I live or die today, you're still gonna die, and not in a pleasant manner. Ted's face was twisted with wrath. "Not only are you going to die, but Shuri and all your relatives and friends are going to die too." He turned to Shuri, who had been silent all this time. Sinfield's family will all die. HKK. His voice rose with vehemence, so much that he could not help but cough up another mouthful of blood. "If you manage to kill me, I think a lot of people will be very grateful." Kiran curled his lip fearlessly. "But you should think about how to save your life now because you're a whisker away from death." He brought his foot down on Ted's broken palm, crushing it to a pulp with only the slightest bit of force, and with that, any chance for it being reattached. Ted stared at his mangled palm in despair. His female companions were staggered to see what was left of his hand. Kiran's wanton violence shocked and enraged them as if they were themselves being ravaged. How dare he? Who gave him the audacity to hurt Ted? It should have been Ted to decide Kiran's fate and make him beg for mercy on his knees. How could Kiran be so domineering? It was simply outrageous. Sam, who was lying on the ground and burning with hatred for Kiran, roared, "Bastard! We're gonna skin you alive for crippling Mr. Ted." He looked at the others. "We're not letting this son of a bitch leave this place alive!" His words immediately stoked everyone's collective fury like a bucket of fuel. Kiran smiled coldly and said nothing, but his hand brushed Ted's bandaged one, exposing his 5 fingers. 3 of them were in plaster, while the other 2 were intact. "What are you doing?" Ted asked in alarm. Kiran glanced at Sam. "I agree with you. Crack!" The next instant, one of Ted's good fingers was broken. "Ah!" Ted's scream made everyone's blood run cold. Kiran stared at Sam. "What was it you were saying just now? Your whole family will die for what you did to Mr. Ted." Crack! With another loud crack, Ted's remaining finger was snapped as well. Kiran kept his eyes on Sam. "I still can't remember what you said. Care to repeat?" Everyone went silent at the sight of the bloody fingers. Sam shut his mouth, too. He was already incapacitated, but now that he had caused Ted to lose 2 fingers, he was merely courting death. At this moment, they finally understood the extent of Kiran's brutality. It was a brutality that frightened them to their core. "Well, aren't you going to talk?" Kiran grinned at Sam. The latter did not dare open his mouth. "In that case, is it my turn to talk now?" Kiran asked mockingly. The crowd's silence indicated their acceptance. "Is there anyone who wants to skin me alive?" A collective shudder rippled through them. At this moment, none of them wanted, or dared, to skin him alive. They remained silent. "Answer me." His eyes bore into Ted. "No." Ted's face was crumpled with agony as he forced out the word. "No," the others shouted in terror. Kiran regarded Ted frostily. "Are you still going to kill Sawyer Sinfield's family?" Ted could feel the grim reaper looming over him. The pain in his hand only amplified his distress, and he quickly shook his head. "No, neither are we." Several others were already sniveling in fear. Crying was the last thing they wanted, but they could not help themselves when Kiran leveled his icy glare at them. Despite their numbers and weapons, they were vulnerable and helpless before him. Kiran raised his hand and pointed at Mysticor Enterprise. "From now on, the Sherman family is forbidden from stepping into this building or else." He trailed off and let his murderous gaze fall on Ted's legs. Having lost his hands, Ted began to tremble from the inside out as if his body had been crushed by a mighty force. He was 100% sure that Kiran would not hesitate to ruin his legs. At this moment, he did not even have the slightest intention to get revenge. Being killed by Kiran meaninglessly was the last thing he wanted. How was he supposed to take on a person who could neither be killed by a dozen blades nor trapped by an entire gang? It would be suicide. Besides, he could not afford to fight to the death with a drain rat who had nothing to lose. I understand," he bit out. Smack. Kiran slapped him. "Louder, clearer, I understand," Ted bellowed with all his strength. Kiran removed his mask. Ted's mind went blank when he saw his face. It's you?" His voice was hoarse, his expression tormented. It was as if his mother had died right in front of him, or as if his heart had been ripped out. Right now, there was no one more pathetic than him. "Get lost." With a swing of his foot, Kiran sent Ted flying. Bam! He slammed into the ground a good distance away with a force enough to shatter his body. However, no amount of physical pain could match his emotional anguish. Indeed, he was devastated by his own blindness and inability to recognize Kiran. By letting Kiran wreck both of his hands on 2 separate occasions, he had made a fool out of himself. A big, huge fool! Kiran had played him like a clown. Ted lay on the ground, overcome with a despair that was more painful than death. Ignoring him, Kiran steered Shuri to the company building. Shuri felt at ease walking beside Kiran. However, she was also rather jittery. The man next to her was like a god of death, one who did not bat an eye when it came to killing. They entered the office building. The receptionist, who had seen what had happened outside, was so frightened that she began shaking wordlessly and even wet her skirt. Kiran frowned slightly at the unpleasant smell but entered the elevator without commenting on it. Shuri led him to Sawyer's office. "This is my godfather's office." Kiran scanned the place and found that it was meticulously decorated with good luck charms for attracting wealth. Apparently, a professional had been consulted, given how perfect the placements were. He could not help his curiosity from ballooning. Not a trace of the Maui tribe's black magic or earth divination was anywhere to be seen. That utterly baffled him. His silence perturbed Shuri. "Did you discover anything?" Kiran shook his head. "Nope." Shuri's head drooped and tears rolled down her cheeks. "Is there really no hope?" Kiran did not answer. A cabinet nearby with a pentagram pattern on it caught his attention. "What's this?" "A safe. Can you open it?" Shuri shook her head. "No, only my godfather knows the password." Kiran walked over and reached out. "Don't." Shuri grabbed his arm. "It's built with a self-destruct function. If you key in the wrong password, it'll blow up right away." Worried that Kiran was not convinced, she continued, "Actually, I don't have the seal they asked for just now. It's in this safe, along with everything else important to the company." Kiran was taken aback by the revelation. Sawyer Sinfield was an interesting man. By sealing the company's fate in a safe and then descending into a coma so no one could open it, wouldn't he be dragging the entire firm down with him? His curiosity piqued. He caught sight of a scanner for fingerprint identification and pressed his right index finger over it. "Hey!" Shuri rushed over to stop him. Click! The door to the safe opened. Chapter 545. How was that possible? Shuri's jaw dropped. Kiran was just as bemused. How come he was able to open Sawyer's safe? What was going on? This made no sense. Why was the safe able to recognize his fingerprint? Was it haunted? He peered inside and saw a box with the words, "To Kiran York" written on it. How Sawyer knew him was completely beyond him. "Does your godfather know anyone else named Kiran York?" He glanced over his shoulder at Shuri. Shuri shook her head. "It's definitely for you. Why else were you able to open the safe with your fingerprint?" Indeed, Kiran understood the box was meant for him the instant the question left his lips, or he could not have possibly opened the safe. Furrowing his brow, he picked up the box, put it on the table, and opened it gently. In it lay a letter that read, "My dear son-in-law Kiran, I hope this letter finds you well." Kiran could feel his head swelling. Next to him, Shuri was astounded. Son-in-law? Whose husband was he? Aurora's or hers? A nervous blush crept over her cheeks. She sneaked a glance at Kiran's handsome face. The memory of her calling him husband in front of Ted stirred a whirl of emotions in her. Kiran opened the letter and read it. Mysticor Enterprise was developed with Aurora and Kiran's union in mind and constitutes part of the assets I reserved for the York family. When the York family realized their impending crisis, they sent me to Fawkes to start a company and gradually develop it. When the family met its end later on, the company fell into my hands, but as a York family member I could not bring myself to engulf the company. Therefore, I renamed it Mysticor Enterprise. When he finished reading, his eyes were misty. Once again, he was deeply moved. Every word in the letter was brimming with Sawyer's loyalty and heartfelt nostalgia for the York family, as well as his desire for Kiran to live. Letting his daughter marry Kiran in the hope of helping the York family continue its bloodline was his own wish, and not Kiran's parents'. It was admirable of him to make such a promise back when the York family had been eradicated and Kiran had gone missing. For a moment, Kiran lost control of his emotions and actually shed a tear. When it fell on the letter, a few more words emerged. Apparently, there were two parts to the letter, but the second part was only visible when the paper was submerged in water. Kiran quickly fetched some water and wet the paper. A line of red handwriting came into view. "I carry the zombie fate spell in me, cast by my sister Fiona before she died. Every year, the spell attacks and puts its victim into a state of eternal sleep. The victim can only be revived by the Maui tribe's fatal spell, failing which they will die. If Kiran's whereabouts are still unknown at that time, I shall donate Mysticor Enterprise as the York family's final contribution to society." The zombie fate spell? Kiran's head buzzed. He had not expected that the zombie fate spell would be here. Before this, he had suspected that it was part of Yvonne's fatal spell, but now that idea seemed to have been disproved. If the fate spell was here, why did it attack Aurora and Macy too? Also, why was he unable to discover it? Kiran was bewildered. He took out the other items in the box. There was the company's contract and various original records, proof that the company belonged to the York family. Clearly, Sawyer had already made up his mind to donate the firm to society after his death and leave behind a good reputation for the York family. He had already relinquished all hope that Kiran was still alive. As for the safe's self-destruct mechanism, it was just a lie. Kiran could not but admire Sawyer for his insight into human nature. Many people would have second thoughts about cracking open the safe by force when they heard that there was a self-destruct mechanism. In this case, no one would touch it before Sawyer died. Aside from the password, the only way to open it was Kiran's fingerprint. Sawyer had succeeded in confusing a lot of people. Kiran was beginning to be curious about this unconscious man. The company's seal was inside too, as well as some authorization letters for future donations. After gradually calming down, Kiran put the items back in the safe. He glanced at Shuri. "Let's go." Shuri was confused about how to address him. Was he her brother-in-law now or the CEO of the company? According to the letter, he was the true successor of Mysticor Enterprise. Kiran perceived her doubts right away. "I don't want this company." "You don't?" Shuri was puzzled. "My wife already has a company of her own. You're married." Shuri's eyes widened with shock and disappointment, as if she had lost something precious. "Let's talk about this another time. We have lives to save." With that, Kiran turned on his heel and strode off. Shuri followed him out. Both of them left Mysticor Enterprise, which Kiran honestly had no intention of taking over. At present, he was not short of money. What he lacked was people like Sawyer, who were devoted to the York family. The passage of time was what shaped a true hero. For 20 years, he had stayed faithful to his initial promise. For 20 years, he had looked forward to the York family's reunion. For 20 years, he had waited for hope. Kiran did not want Sawyer to lose all of this. When he and Shuri returned to the villa, the Healing Prince immediately greeted him respectfully. "Mr. Kiran, from now on you will work as a security guard at Mysticor Enterprise. If anyone makes trouble, do whatever you need, whether it involves poison or murder," Kiran ordered coldly. "Yes, sir." Sensing his murderous anger, the Healing Prince obeyed without hesitation. At once, he hurried downstairs, left the villa, and set out for Mysticor Enterprise. Once again, Shuri was dumbfounded. The fact that a famous doctor like the Healing Prince was working as a security guard was enough to make the headlines. However, he obviously regarded the opportunity to work for Kiran as an honor. Kiran was truly a remarkable man. Shuri was so used to being flabbergasted by him that she was no longer surprised. She was more curious about him than anything. What made this man different from the others? Also, what kind of woman could conquer a man like him? Indeed, only a fairy or goddess could bring a man like him to his knees. She considered herself a beauty who had numerous suitors in Fox. However, she was aware that Kiran had never looked at her properly. Besides being aloof and arrogant, he was also assertive. She was somewhat mesmerized by him. Kiran walked up to Sawyer, took out a silver needle, and pricked his own finger. Then he pried open Sawyer's mouth and let the blood oozing from his wound drip inside. Shuri watched him with round, puzzled eyes. Drip, drip, drip. After the 7th drop, Kiran removed his hand. He reached out and massaged Sawyer's body briefly. However, the latter did not wake up as he had anticipated. He was stunned. He stretched his hand out to examine Sawyer's pulse. Chapter 546. Sawyer's pulse was throbbing normally, but he remained unresponsive, much like a patient in a vegetative state. Was he really under the zombie fate spell? If so, why was the fusion of the love spell and fatal spell in his blood unable to revive him? Kiran was staggered. Sawyer's pulse could not have returned to normal if it was ineffective. However, if it was effective, why didn't he wake up? Now, Kiran was even more deterred from forcefully resuscitating him. He dribbled his blood into Macy and Aurora's mouth one after another. Almost immediately, their pulses grew stronger and gradually returned to normal, but they did not stir. Shuri gazed at him with anxiousness and confusion in her eyes. After pondering for a moment, Kiran decided to wait and see if they needed more time to awaken. He looked at Shuri. "Don't worry, they'll wake up." Shuri nodded cluelessly, though she seemed a little dubious about his reassurance. "From now on, you're in charge of Mysticor Enterprise. You can tell Ted to piss off," Kiran suddenly ordered. Instead of showing delight, Shuri's face fell. "It's not that I don't want to be in charge. I just don't have that kind of credibility. Plus, Ted may not be willing to accept my leadership." "You're not confident?" Kiran frowned in displeasure. "You think I don't want to run the company properly? You think I don't want Mysticor Enterprise to be stable? Didn't you see how helpless I was today? Didn't you see how those security guards beat me up? I don't have credibility or ability. I'm just useless." Shuri looked disheartened and ready to abandon herself to despair. During this period, she had to take care of her godfather and battle Ted at the same time. For this, she sought out many people in the company for help, but no one showed her respect. Even those who Sawyer had favored in the past scorned her. They demanded she hand over the company's seal and make herself scarce. What was worse, Ted tried to force himself on her. She was humiliated repeatedly because she was not strong enough to fight back. As a result, she became disillusioned with Mysticor Enterprise. Therefore, hearing Kiran's plan only made her helpless and sad. If he had stood up for her sooner outside the office building, she would not have been beaten. Fury welled up in her at the thought. "Kiran, what's the point of humiliating a loser like me? Just stop it." She shook her head. "Mysticor Enterprise belongs to you now, so you can figure it out yourself. I'll stay here with my godparents." She plopped into a nearby chair, trembling slightly, tears rolling down her face. "Do you hate me for not protecting you today?" asked Kiran. "No!" Shuri shook her head. "You have no obligation to protect me anyway. We're just strangers." Kiran was somewhat surprised to learn that she had a strong personality. He sat down as well. "You mad?" Shuri closed her eyes and remained silent. "You're not going to forgive me?" Kiran chuckled. "Kiran York, you're crossing a line. You're a big bully." "Aye." Shuri could no longer contain her anger and she exploded. However, her face was cupped between Kiran's palms before she could continue. She had never been so intimate with a man before, and her body instantly melted into a puddle. "Well, what are you doing?" "Aye." Her next words died in her throat when she felt a cool sensation on her face. As the burning pain disappeared, she calmed down. She looked at Kiran and found his gaze clear and devoid of desire. "Why don't you let me heal your injuries?" Kiran offered. "Heal me?" Shuri repeated in perplexity. How was this possible? How could he heal her just by holding her face? Still, she could not deny that it felt good. She would have thought Kiran was taking advantage of her if she had not felt the healing sensation herself. "I'll only be in Fox for 3 days, Kiran informed her. "You're leaving in 3 days?" Shuri stared at him in surprise and disappointment. Chapter. Instead of answering, Kiran continued, "There are matters in Mysticor Enterprise that I can't intervene in." "Why?" Shuri grew more and more agitated. "If I do, the troublemakers won't show themselves and I won't be able to eliminate all of them?" What do you think will happen when I'm gone? What will happen to my godparents and Aurora in 3 days? Shuri wanted to know. I'm hoping they'll wake up, but I'll take them with me if they don't. They're not going to die. What about me? You stay here and run Mysticor Enterprise. Is there something you're not telling me? Shuri could not contain her curiosity. If you already know that, why do you still ask? Shuri's temper flared. You, ask the Healing Prince to protect you. No one will dare lay a finger on you. Shuri was relieved at the mention of the Healing Prince. Fine then. Why do you believe in me, though? Why not? I'm an outsider. Aren't you Aurora's sister? Are you going to marry her? Kiran shook his head. I already have a wife. Once again, Shuri fell silent. What you have to do now is piss off Walter, William, and also the members of Lions Club. Those people must either die or be crippled. I'm not going to let them give me trouble. When I leave in 3 days, I hope Mysticor Enterprise has become a company worthy of everyone's respect in Fox. Kiran's tone was icy and authoritative. It sent tremors through Shuri's delicate body and sparked a passion in her heart. In the end, she replied vehemently, I understand. I promise you'll be able to leave in 3 days. Kiran was impressed by her attitude and told her about his plans and ideas. She agreed to all of them and left after the discussion. Buzz! Kiran's phone vibrated. It was from Ruth. He answered it. What's the matter? Mr. York, where are you? I'm planning to deliver the money to you. Kiran was delighted that she was keeping her promise. I'm at East City Villas. East City Villas? Ruth was surprised. Yeah, which villa should I deliver the money to? Just when Kiran was about to reply, another Fox number called. Thinking it was Shuri, he hung up on Ruth and answered it. A woman's haughty voice came. Are you Kiran York? It was not Shuri. Kiran knitted his brow. That's me. Who's speaking? The woman said impatiently. Faith Dela Cruz, Ruby Laughlin's friend. Ruby? Kiran was even more astonished. He was just a passerby who had drunk Ruby's mortal love wine and helped her resolve Mortal Dream's crisis, so why was her friend calling him? Ruby asked me to tell you she's doing fine, but she can't come and see you. She wished you a pleasant time in Fox and told you not to go looking for her. Faith's tone was cold and flat. Her words only served to further confuse Kiran. They seemed to carry a hidden message, a message asking him for help. Remember, don't go looking for Ruby or you're going to cause trouble for her, Faith reminded him loftily. Kiran's frown deepened. When did he ever say he was going to look for Ruby? He barely thought about her during his time in Fox. When he did not respond, Faith went on in annoyance. You men are like flies, always buzzing around beautiful women whenever you see one. Kiran was nonplussed. A word of advice. Quit pestering Ruby. Kiran's face was as black as thunder. I'll tell you in person when I see you tonight. Faith sniffed. Kiran had initially decided against meeting this madwoman, but now he was starting to find her interesting. Sure. I'll meet you at the Seasons Hotel at 3 in the afternoon. Make sure you're on time. If you don't show up, there will be consequences. Faith hung up. A smirk tugged at Kiran's lips when her call ended. He located Ruth's number, dialed it, and gave her instructions. Chapter 548. At 3 in the afternoon, Kiran came to the Seasons Hotel. Coincidentally, he came here to meet the Campbells before, but this time he was here to meet a strange woman. Kiran was not looking forward to it at all. He was just curious about what kind of trouble Ruby got into. Kiran entered the hotel and went into a room right away. 2 beautiful women were sitting in the room. One of them was wearing a purple mini dress that hugged her curves and showed off her long legs. The dress was short enough to show the black stockings underneath, accentuating her fair skin through the sheer fabric which aroused men's senses. The woman had a small face and round eyes, and she seemed to be in her 20s. She looked like she could be a news anchor as she exuded a womanly aura. It was the woman who called earlier Faith Dela Cruz. The other woman looked slightly older, perhaps in her late 20s. She appeared to be at the age between youth and maturity. She had a tall and slender figure, fair skin, and a beautiful face coupled with a charming physique. She was wearing a short black dress without stockings, displaying her long, fair legs. A mature aura emanated from her like perfume. She looked like she could be a celebrity. Her name was Shirley Bush. The 2 women sat there condescendingly as if any men who laid eyes on them would feel so inferior and humbled that they would grovel at their feet. Some might even lack the courage to approach them. The 2 women were whispering to each other when Kiran opened the door. They obviously did not expect it and were surprised at first, but that was soon replaced by anger at his rudeness. Their eyes fell upon Kiran. Although he was handsome and dressed in designer clothing, they still looked down on him. The fact that he did not even knock on the door showed how rude and ungentlemanly he was. He was completely unworthy of them, let alone Ruby. For Ruby to be acquainted with such a man was the equivalent of a flower being planted in cow dung. They did not think he was even worthy of showing up here. "Are you Kiran?" Faith asked coldly. Kiran did not respond right away. Faith was even more upset not to hear a response from him. A man with no manners. Fatih hung out with rich people every day. Even the most arrogant guy would behave like a gentleman around beautiful women like them, let alone a nobody like Kiran. He was nothing but an uneducated scum. Faith turned to Shirley and said, "Ruby has embarrassed us." In her eyes, Kiran was not even worthy of being around them. "Are you Faith?" Kiran asked calmly as if he had just come to his senses. "Ha!" Seeing as he did not even have the basic manners of saying hello, Faith smiled disdainfully. "Yes, I'm Faith." Faith deliberately asked again mockingly, "And you're Kiran?" Coming from Maui, a cheerful person like Ruby would never fall in love with a man like him. "I'm Kiran." Kiran sat at the table and said, "Why do you want to see me?" What happened to Ruby? Faith did not expect Kiran to be so calm and composed. He even asked her questions like it was an interrogation. She was furious. "Who are you? Who do you think you are? You should be grateful that a man like you can even lay eyes on a woman like me. I don't know what Ruby sees in you, asking us to come meet you. Fox is not a place for people like you. Don't even come close to Ruby. The men who are around her are either rich or noble." When Kiran sat down, he was met with a hurricane of verbal assault. "Hello, miss. Should we serve the meal now?" At that moment, a waiter came in and asked Faith. "No, our guest hasn't arrived yet." Shirley finally spoke up and glanced at Kiran. "He's not worthy of eating here." Faith looked at Kiran and chuckled. "The average amount people spend here is 3,000. If you don't have status or a membership, you can't eat here. If not for us, I'm afraid that you will never have the chance to enter this place in your entire life." She looked at the waiter and said, "Tell him, can a person like him dine here?" Kiran almost laughed at her words. The waiter was put on the spot. She knew Kiran had come here that afternoon, and although he left quickly, he did come. How was she going to answer her question? She could not embarrass her customers, right? The waiter smiled without answering. Faith thought that the waiter was embarrassed to say it out loud, so she smirked at Kiran. "You see? Even the waiter is more polite than you for trying to save you the embarrassment." "She's saving you the embarrassment," Kiran replied. "What did you say?" "Peft." Shirley burst out laughing. "Haha." Faith laughed too. "Did you say she's saving me the embarrassment?" "Kiran, you're too funny. I didn't think you were the type to stoop so low." Faith could not believe how rude Kiran was. Shirley was laughing so hard that she was speechless. "If Ruby is fine, I'm leaving." Kiran did not want to deal with these two crazy women, let alone argue with them about such a trivial matter, so he left. Faith stopped laughing and shouted, "Wait, what?" Faith went up to tug at Kiran's clothes. "I bet a woman bought this for you." Kiran remembered that Snow had bought these clothes for him, so he answered truthfully, "Yes. If Ruby hadn't spent money on clothes for you, you would have never been able to afford clothes like this." Faith smirked. Shirley looked up at Kiran and said, "You and Ruby are from different worlds. You should stay away from her from now on." What they said was true. They were indeed from different worlds because Kiran was leagues above Ruby. Kiran simply nodded and smiled. "I know we're from different worlds. It's good that you know. We wanted to meet you to remind you not to look for Ruby and not to disrupt her wedding." Faith crossed her right leg above her left and continued, "As a man, you should face reality. Oftentimes, men aren't even qualified to crawl at a woman's feet. If Ruby told her friends to inform Kiran that she was about to get married, did that not mean she did not want to marry that guy?" Kiran asked curiously. "Ruby is getting married?" Chapter 549. "Ha!" Shirley chuckled and looked at Faith. "You see, I bet he's so used to leeching off Ruby that he's afraid of losing her. Kiran, forget about the details. I suggest you go back to where you came from. Fox isn't for people like you." Faith picked up a cup of tea and took a sip as her glossy red lips glowed under the light. She shot Kiran a smug look. "You two are worlds apart. You don't deserve her at all." She took out her phone and said, "Listen to what Ruby said." She played the recording of Ruby's voice. "Kiran, I wish you all the best." "Don't worry about me. Everything is fine on my end. My only bottle of mortal love wine was spent without regret." After the voice recording ended, Faith put her phone away and looked at Kiran. "Did you hear that?" Shirley glanced at Kiran with disdain. "Ruby is doing fine. She wishes you all the best, which means she's breaking up with you. Do you get it?" Kiran pondered the final sentence. "My only bottle of mortal love wine was spent without regret." It was a confession to Kiran and a plea for help. Perhaps Ruby did not want to marry the man. Who was she getting married to? Kiran remembered how he acted at Mortal Dream Bar, which was probably why Ruby pinned her hopes on him. Perhaps he was her only hope. This was not how he expected his trip to Fox to go. Kiran fell silent. Faith thought that Kiran was afraid now that he had lost his sugar mommy, so she sneered, "Kiran, it's time to face reality. It doesn't matter what relationship you had with Ruby in the past. You're just a stranger to her now." Kiran decided to deal with Mysticor first, then Ruby. Since she said that everything was fine, she should be safe for now. He gave Faith a nod and said, "All right." Faith was relieved to hear him say that. "When are you leaving Fox?" Instead of answering her question, he told Faith, "I don't know who Ruby is marrying, but I know she doesn't want to marry him. If you can find out who she's marrying, feel free to let me know. I can help her deal with it." Not even a second after feeling relieved, Faith's anger surged again. Was there something wrong with this guy's head? How dare a rude guy like him say such a thing? Even a wealthy heiress like her with billions of assets dared not guarantee to help Ruby deal with anything. But Kiran did. Bullshit. How rude and ignorant could he get? What a joke. Faith shook her head, extremely disappointed with Kiran. Ruby never said she didn't want to get married. My phone number is valid for 3 more days in Fox. After 3 days, I won't accept any more calls, Kiran said coldly. How dare you, Shirley retorted. Faith shrugged. Enough. You can stop with the act now. We're not Ruby, so there's no way we'll ever fancy a guy like you. If you want another sugar mommy, you can look elsewhere. Shirley nodded. Now that you've lost Ruby, you want to target us? As if. Faith snorted. Even powerful people in Fox like us dare not claim to help Ruby. You're just her boy toy. What gives you the right to say such a thing? Waving her hand in annoyance, she said, "Leave. I bet it's an honor for you to even tell people you've been at the Seasons Hotel. Mr. Kiran, are you done?" At that moment, a woman's gentle voice sounded at the door. Her voice was sweet and respectful. "After you're done, come to the Crown for dinner," Ruth said. "Mr. Kiran? The Crown?" Faith and Shirley were stunned. They turned and saw Ruth standing by the door with a respectful smile, but her gaze was focused on Kiran. Ruth was wearing a long white dress. She was no longer as serious as she was on the plane today. She looked much more elegant with her womanly charm on full display. Ruth had put on light makeup with some eyeshadow and red lipstick, making her look effortlessly beautiful and sexy. She looked like a goddess. Even the narcissistic Faith and Shirley felt that her beauty outshone theirs. Kiran was pleased to see Ruth's outfit and that she even made dinner for him. "You look better than I expected." Ruth blushed at his compliment, looking both embarrassed and happy. "Ha," Faith scoffed. "Kiran, you sure know how to put on an act. I can't believe you hired an actor just to get Ruby to stay. I can't believe you would stoop so low just to be a kept man. People like you aren't allowed in the Crown. The more you act like this, the more you make me look down on you." She made up her mind to badmouth Kiran to Ruby. She wanted Ruby to see Kiran's true colors so that she would not be deceived by such a man. Shirley also chuckled in contempt. "Kiran, you should rely on your own efforts in life. Faking it like this would only tarnish your character. You might not even get what you want in the end, and—" Shirley covered her mouth and laughed. "You look like a male prostitute to me!" Faith nodded. "Shirley is right. I know this is fake, but can you at least try to make it look real?" She pointed at the Seasons Hotel and said, "This hotel is owned by the Sutton family, and that's their family's private room. It's not open to the public. Even if you're an actor, can't you pick a more realistic location?" Kiran was surprised to hear that the hotel was owned by the Suttons. He turned to look at Ruth. Faith and Shirley were also looking at Ruth, but their expressions suddenly looked strange. Then, they turned to each other curiously. Why did that woman kind of look like Ruth Sutton? Ruth usually dressed as Kiran saw her on the plane. As the mayor's daughter, she was a figure many respected and admired, so she always had to look prim and proper. When did she ever get the chance to dress up as a woman? Now that she was dressed differently, Faith and Shirley failed to recognize her. "M's Ruth." Faith and Shirley shouted at the same time. Both of them stood up quickly. They were so anxious that they knocked their teacups over and wet their dresses, but they did not care. They went up to her and smiled. "Hello, Ms. Ruth." The arrogance and contempt on their faces when they were talking to Kiran had disappeared. Although they were socialites in Focus upper class, their worth was far behind Ruth's. They knew that, in reality, power was far more significant than money. They were powerless in the face of Kiran's new advantage. "Mr. Kiran, I've personally made dinner for you at the Crown. Please enjoy your dinner." Ruth ignored the two women and left them dumbstruck. Chapter 550. Faith and Shirley were utterly shocked after confirming that it was Ruth. They could not believe the Sutton family would treat Kiran with such respect. Hearing that Ruth personally cooked dinner for Kiran was shocking. It was as if Kiran was her father or her husband. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kiran, for not recognizing you this afternoon. Feel free to ask me for anything during your meal. I hope you will forgive me," the waiter apologized with a pale face. "Mr. Kiran, you had lunch here?" Ruth asked curiously. My friend invited me. It's such a coincidence that I used the same room twice today. Kiran smiled. The same room? Twice? Faith and Shirley were shocked. Ordinary people could not afford a place like this. The people who came here were either from the Sutton family or just very rich. They invited Kiran here today to show him that they were from different worlds and to curry favor with the Sutton family as well. They were doomed. The person they despised actually ate here twice that day. They thought he would never be able to come here if not for them. Only now did they realize that was not the case. They had underestimated him. They did not believe him when he said he was saving them from embarrassment at first, but now they were convinced. The hardest truth was that they had indirectly offended the Sutton family by insulting Kiran. They completely offended them before they even had the chance to curry favor. It was over for them. From now on, anytime Mr. Kiran dines here, it will be free of charge. Let him use the private room anytime he wants, Ruth told the waiter. Yes, Ms. Ruth, the waiter nodded. Mr. Kiran, please come upstairs with me. I don't want your food to get cold, Ruth said respectfully. Kiran nodded and left, ignoring Faith and Shirley completely. If Ruby was seeking help, he would help her. These two women simply did not know any better. Faith and Shirley blushed, obviously looking forward to talking to Ruth. To their delight, Ruth turned around. Ms. Ruth! Faith and Shirley greeted her smilingly, trying to redeem themselves. Mr. Kiran is our family's very important person. If you look down on Mr. Kiran, that means you look down on the Suttons. Ruth's voice was indifferent. Faith and Shirley trembled and glanced at Kiran, who had paused in his steps. Suddenly, he appeared taller, and they felt considerably smaller as discomfort overwhelmed them. They clenched their fists tightly as they lowered their heads silently. Regret washed over them like a tsunami, relentlessly crashing against the walls of their hearts. They could have used this opportunity to befriend Kiran and be introduced to the Suttons, but they missed it. They had lost the Sutton family's protection because of their arrogance. They were filled with regret. Kiran, somebody they looked down upon, turned out to be more powerful than all the rich kids around them. They thought that he was just a rude bumpkin, but they realized that they were the rude ones. Kiran was just being humble. Ruth even personally cooked dinner for Kiran. They bet even her future husband would not receive such treatment from her. They were genuinely afraid that one word from Kiran would put their livelihood at stake. Kiran turned to look at them, making them so frightened that their legs weakened, almost kneeling before him. Tell Ruby that if she's in trouble, she can look for me within 3 days. After that, she's on her own. Kiran's tone was calm and firm. Faith and Shirley nodded respectfully. Yes, sir, we'll let her know. They quickly took the chance to look at Ruth. Goodbye, Ms. Ruth. Their calm demeanor earlier was replaced by panic as they could not wait to leave. Their encounter with Kiran had left them traumatized, overwhelming them to the point that it was unbearable. They would probably need a long time to recover from this. However, they had only one thought, to establish a good relationship with Kiran in the hope of becoming his friend. That way, they could borrow his connections. Both of you aren't allowed in the Seasons Hotel anymore, Ruth said mercilessly. Both were shaking. They had ruined their chances of forming a connection with the Sutton family, but they dared not respond, so they just walked away with a heart full of despair. They knew that they had blown a huge opportunity. Mr. Kiran, come this way, please. Ruth turned to look at Kiran with a respectful smile. Kiran nodded and followed her to dinner. He was starving. He did not get to eat with Archie at all earlier in the afternoon. Right now, he was ready to feast. At the entrance of the Crown's private room, Ruth opened the door for him. Before he even stepped in, his nostrils were assaulted by the smell of burnt food. He looked at the table to see that everything was black. He felt as if he was looking at a pile of coal. He was not even sure whether they were poisoned. Ruth's pretty face turned red. She lowered her head and said, "It looks bad, right?" Her voice was soft and delicate enough to make anyone's heart melt. Kiran immediately realized this pampered, rich lady did not know how to cook, so he smiled and said, "No, I've been cooking all afternoon. I've searched many recipes and got a lot of advice from the chefs." Ruth could not bring herself to continue. Her voice was choked as she tightly held her hands behind her. Kiran saw the band-aids on her hand and realized it was probably her first time cooking. Her efforts touched him, so he smiled. "I'm hungry, so why don't you serve me some bread first?" He walked over, grabbed a piece of unassuming ribs, and took a bite. The meat was so tough it was clinging to the bone and so burnt it tasted bitter. However, Kiran smiled and said, "It tastes good." "It does." Ruth was in disbelief. She picked up a piece and put it in her mouth. "Pooey, pooey, pooey!" She spat it out right away. Don't eat it." Ruth was so embarrassed she almost cried. She quickly tried to stop him, but Kiran continued eating calmly. "I'm not a rich young lady like you, so as long as I can fill myself up, I'm happy." Kiran took the breadbasket from the waiter and started eating. Ruth's expression looked complicated, but she was happy and touched by how sweet he was. She even wished she could cook for him every day. Kiran was calm. With a wife like Snow, he was well aware of what women were like in today's society. Looks? Check. Body? Check. Beauty? Check. Arrogance? Check. They only lacked gentleness and kindness, so the fact that Ruth offered to cook was already considered generous. He finished his meal and put his utensils down. Blushing, Ruth immediately stood up and walked to the door.